In the heart of a bustling Midwestern city where skyscrapers kissed the clouds and streets buzzed with life, lived Special Agent Marcus Hale. He wasn't just any agent. He was one of the best in the FBI. Known for his sharp mind, calm nature, and dedication to justice, Marcus had earned respect from colleagues across the country. But behind his professional success lay a personal struggle. Marcus often faced subtle prejudice because of the color of his skin. Despite this, he never let it stop him from doing what he believed was right. One day, Marcus received an assignment that would test not only his skills, but also his resolve. The FBI had been tracking a dangerous organized crime syndicate operating in the city. This group wasn't small time. They were involved in drug trafficking, illegal weapon sales, and even violent acts like extortion and murder. They operated in the shadows, using fear to control neighborhoods and silence anyone who dared speak out against them. For months, the FBI had tried to gather enough evidence to take them down, but the criminals always seemed one step ahead. Marcus was chosen to lead the operation because of his experience in undercover work. His task was clear: infiltrate the gang, gain their trust, and collect enough evidence to bring them to justice. It was a risky mission, but Marcus accepted without hesitation. He knew how much was at stake, not just for the safety of the city, but for the countless innocent people whose lives were being destroyed by these criminals. To prepare for his role, Marcus spent weeks studying the gang's behavior, learning their slang, and understanding their hierarchy. He transformed himself completely, trading his usual neat suits for worn-out jeans and hoodies. He grew a scruffy beard and adopted a rougher demeanor to blend in. Every detail mattered, and Marcus left nothing to chance. By the time he stepped into the world of the gang, no one could tell he was anything other than who he claimed to be, a man looking for money and power. As part of his cover, Marcus frequented places where the gang members hung out. Bars with flickering neon signs, abandoned warehouses on the outskirts of town, and dimly lit alleys became his new stomping grounds. Slowly but surely, he began earning their trust. At first, they gave him minor tasks, delivering messages or keeping watch during deals. But as weeks turned into months, Marcus proved his loyalty. Soon, he found himself attending high-stakes meetings and overhearing conversations about upcoming operations. Each piece of information brought him closer to dismantling the entire organization. While working undercover, Marcus maintained close contact with local law enforcement. Coordination between agencies was crucial for the success of the operation. However, there was something troubling brewing beneath the surface. During briefings with police officers, Marcus noticed a pattern. Some cops seemed unusually defensive when questioned about certain areas of the city controlled by the gang. Their answers were vague, almost evasive, raising suspicions in Marcus's mind. Could some members of the police force be secretly helping the criminals? If so, it would explain why previous attempts to catch the gang had failed. Despite his growing unease, Marcus focused on his mission. He couldn't afford distractions. Every interaction with the gang put his life on the line, and one wrong move could expose him. Still, the thought lingered in the back of his mind. Was he walking into a trap set by both the gang and corrupt cops? He pushed the worry aside, reminding himself that paranoia wouldn't help. What mattered most was staying alert and gathering as much evidence as possible. One evening, after weeks of careful maneuvering, Marcus struck gold. He overheard a conversation between two high-ranking members of the gang discussing a massive shipment of illegal weapons arriving in the city within days. This was the breakthrough the FBI had been waiting for. With this information, they could finally dismantle the gang's operations and arrest its leaders. Excited yet cautious, Marcus relayed the details to his team immediately. They began planning a coordinated raid to intercept the shipment before it reached its destination. But as Marcus prepared to leave the meeting spot, disaster struck. Two figures emerged from the shadows blocking his path. They weren't gang members, they were police officers. Officer Greg Lawson and Officer Ryan Hicks, both known for their aggressive tactics and questionable ethics, approached Marcus with hostility. Their body language screamed suspicion, and their eyes narrowed as they demanded to know what he was doing in such a dangerous area late at night. Marcus froze for a moment, his heart pounding. Had they figured out his true identity? Or worse, were they working with the gang? The tension in the air was palpable. Marcus quickly reminded himself to stay calm. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his FBI badge, holding it up for them to see. "I'm Special Agent Marcus Hale," he said firmly, hoping the authority in his voice would diffuse the situation. Instead, the officers laughed mockingly. "Nice try," sneered Lawson, stepping closer. "You think we're gonna fall for that?" Hicks chimed in, his tone laced with disdain. "You look more like scum than a Fed." Marcus realized then that this wasn't going to end peacefully. These men weren't interested in hearing the truth. Something darker was at play here, something rooted in prejudice and corruption. As Lawson reached for his gun, Marcus braced himself, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether he lived or died. This marked the beginning of a harrowing ordeal that would change Marcus's life forever and shine a light on the deep-seated issues plaguing the system he had sworn to protect. Little did he know the events of that night would ripple far beyond the alleyway, igniting a firestorm of outrage, accountability, and ultimately, hope for a better future. The alley was dark and quiet, save for the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves caught in the chilly breeze. Marcus stood frozen, his mind racing as Officer Greg Lawson and Officer Ryan Hicks closed in on him. The dim glow of a flickering street lamp cast long shadows across the narrow space, making the scene feel even more surreal. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed. He had faced dangerous situations before, but this felt different, personal. "I'm telling you, I'm Special Agent Marcus Hale," he repeated, raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't a threat. His voice was steady, though inside he was anything but calm. "Check my badge if you don't believe me." He held it out again, hoping they'd take a closer look. But instead of examining it, Lawson snatched it from his hand with a sneer. "This could be fake," Lawson snapped, tossing the badge onto the ground like it was worthless. "What kind of Fed dresses like this?" He gestured dismissively at Marcus's worn-out hoodie and jeans, clearly mocking his appearance. Hicks chuckled coldly, crossing his arms over his chest. "Yeah, you don't exactly scream law enforcement," he added, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Marcus clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He wanted to explain that his disguise was part of an undercover operation, but something told him these men weren't interested in explanations. Their body language screamed hostility, and their words carried an undercurrent of disdain that went beyond suspicion. It was prejudice, plain and simple. "Listen," Marcus said, trying to keep his tone measured. "I'm working on a major case. This isn't a coincidence. I'm here for a reason. If you just call your superior or check with the FBI, you'll see." "Oh, we know who you are," Lawson interrupted, taking another step forward. His hand hovered near the holster of his gun, a silent threat hanging in the air. "You're the guy stirring up trouble around here, always poking your nose where it doesn't belong." Marcus frowned, confusion mixing with unease. "What are you talking about? I'm not causing trouble. I'm stopping it. That's my job." Hicks laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Stopping it? You think walking around dressed like one of them makes things better? People like you stir up problems wherever you go." The comment hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. People like me? Was this really about the color of his skin? He had suspected racism within certain parts of the police department, but hearing it so blatantly confirmed was jarring. For a moment, anger flared inside him, but he quickly pushed it down. Losing his temper wouldn't help. Staying alive was all that mattered now. "Look," Marcus tried again, his voice firmer this time. "I don't want any trouble. Let me make a phone call and we can clear this up. There's no need for this to escalate." But Lawson wasn't listening. His face twisted into a scowl, and he spat out a string of insults laced with racial slurs. Each word cut deeper than the last, designed to provoke and demean. Marcus felt his stomach churn, but he refused to let them see how much their words affected him. Instead, he focused on finding a way out of the situation. "You've got two options," Lawson growled, pulling his gun halfway out of its holster. "Either come quietly, or we do this the hard way." Marcus raised his hands. higher, palms facing outward. "There's no reason for this," he said evenly, though his pulse quickened. "I'm unarmed, I'm cooperating, just let me explain." But Hicks had other plans. With a smirk, he drew his own weapon and fired a shot into the air. The sound echoed through the alley, startling Marcus and sending a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. "That's enough talk," Hicks barked. "You're coming with us." The bullet hadn't been aimed at Marcus, but the message was clear. Resistance would mean death. Marcus took a cautious step backward, his mind racing. He needed to de-escalate the situation, but every instinct told him these men weren't going to back down. They were too angry, too blinded by their hatred to listen to reason. As he retreated further into the shadows, Lawson shouted after him, his voice sharp and commanding. "Don't make us chase you. We will shoot." Marcus hesitated, weighing his options. Running might give him a chance to escape, but it also risked provoking them further. Staying put meant trusting them to act professionally, and given their behavior so far, that seemed unlikely. Still, he couldn't afford to panic. Every decision counted. Suddenly, Hicks raised his gun again, this time aiming directly at Marcus. Without warning, he pulled the trigger. A searing pain tore through Marcus's left arm as the bullet grazed him, leaving a deep gash. He staggered backward, clutching the wound as blood began to soak through his sleeve. The shock of being shot momentarily paralyzed him, but survival instincts kicked in almost instantly. Through gritted teeth, Marcus managed to mutter, "Are you insane? I'm an FBI agent." But Lawson and Hicks only laughed, their expressions devoid of remorse. "Not anymore," Lawson sneered, stepping closer. "You're just another thug now." Marcus knew then that reasoning with them was futile. These men weren't interested in justice or truth. They were drunk on power and prejudice. He had to act fast if he wanted to survive. Using the last reserves of strength, he turned and sprinted deeper into the alley, dodging trash bins and leaping over debris. Behind him, he heard footsteps pounding against the pavement and shouts growing louder. For what felt like an eternity, Marcus ran, his injured arm throbbing with each movement. The world blurred around him as fear and determination propelled him forward. He didn't know where he was headed, only that he needed to put as much distance between himself and those officers as possible. Finally, he spotted a side street leading away from the chaos. Ducking into it, he pressed himself against the wall, breathing heavily. Blood trickled down his arm, staining his clothes, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was staying hidden until the danger passed. Minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly, each second stretching into an eternity. When the footsteps faded and the shouting stopped, Marcus allowed himself a small sigh of relief. But he knew he wasn't safe yet. Clutching his wounded arm, he stumbled toward the nearest intersection, praying someone would find him before it was too late. Hours later, a young woman walking her dog discovered Marcus slumped against a lamppost, pale and bleeding. She immediately called 911, her voice trembling as she described the scene. Emergency responders arrived shortly after, loading Marcus into an ambulance and rushing him to the hospital. As the sirens wailed in the background, Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, haunted by the faces of the men who had attacked him. Little did he know his fight was far from over. What happened in that alley would spark outrage, ignite debates about systemic racism, and ultimately lead to a reckoning that would shake the foundations of law enforcement. But for now, all Marcus could focus on was surviving, and hoping that justice would prevail in the end. Marcus's escape through the dark alleyways of the city felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Every step jarred his injured arm, sending waves of pain radiating through his body. But he pushed forward, driven by sheer willpower. His breath came in ragged gasps and his vision blurred as blood loss began to take its toll. Still, he refused to stop moving. He knew that if Lawson and Hicks caught up to him, they wouldn't hesitate to finish what they had started. As he stumbled into a quieter side street, Marcus leaned against the cold brick wall of a building, trying to catch his breath. The adrenaline that had fueled his flight was fading fast, leaving behind exhaustion and despair. He glanced down at his wounded arm, now soaked with blood, and realized the severity of the situation. If he didn't get help soon, he might not survive the night. But calling for assistance wasn't an option. Not yet. Not while those officers were still out there, hunting him like prey. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to think about how wrong everything had gone. He had dedicated his life to protecting others, to upholding justice, and yet here he was, bleeding and alone because two men sworn to serve and protect had turned on him. Their actions weren't just reckless. They were malicious, fueled by prejudice and corruption. It wasn't just about him. It was about the system that allowed such behavior to exist unchecked. The realization filled him with anger, but also resolve. If he made it through this alive, he vowed to expose them, to make sure no one else suffered the way he was suffering now. Summoning the last reserves of his strength, Marcus forced himself to keep moving. He staggered toward the nearest main road, hoping to find someone who could help. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog echoing in the night. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each second dragging on as his body grew weaker. Finally, after what felt like hours, he reached a dimly lit intersection where a young woman was walking her dog. She noticed him immediately, her eyes widening in shock as she took in his disheveled appearance and the blood staining his clothes. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed, rushing over to him. "Are you okay? What happened?" Marcus tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. All he could manage was a faint whisper. "Help. Please." The woman quickly pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice trembling as she explained the situation to the operator. "There's a man here. He's hurt badly. I think he's been shot," she said urgently. While waiting for help to arrive, she knelt beside Marcus, offering words of comfort. "Stay with me," she urged gently. "Help is coming." Minutes later, the piercing wail of sirens cut through the silence. An ambulance screeched to a halt at the scene, and paramedics rushed to Marcus's side. They carefully lifted him onto a stretcher, wrapping his wound to stop the bleeding. As they worked, Marcus slipped in and out of consciousness, fragments of thoughts swirling in his mind. He thought about his family, his colleagues, and the unfinished case he had risked so much for. Would anyone believe him when he told them what happened? Or would Lawson and Hicks succeed in twisting the truth to protect themselves? At the hospital, doctors and nurses sprang into action, stabilizing Marcus and preparing him for surgery. The bullet had grazed his arm, but had come dangerously close to severing major arteries. Another inch, and he might have bled out before, reaching help. After hours of intense medical care, Marcus was finally moved to a recovery room. Though physically battered, his mind remained sharp, replaying the events of the night over and over again. Each memory brought fresh anger and renewed determination. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Lawson and Hicks scrambled to cover their tracks. They knew they had crossed a line, and the consequences would be severe if anyone found out what they had done. Returning to the alley where they had confronted Marcus, they planted false evidence, a discarded weapon and a bag of drugs, intending to frame him for resisting arrest and possessing illegal substances. They reported the incident to their superiors, claiming that Marcus had attacked them during a routine patrol and that they had acted in self-defense. Their story was a web of lies, meticulously crafted to shift blame and avoid accountability. But even as they worked to distort the truth, cracks began to form in their narrative. Surveillance cameras in nearby businesses had captured footage of the altercation, showing Lawson and Hicks confronting Marcus without provocation. Witnesses who had seen the officers behaving aggressively earlier in the evening came forward, corroborating details of the encounter. And then there was the young woman who had found Marcus. Her testimony provided a clear account of his condition and demeanor when she discovered him. Piece by piece, the real story began to emerge. News of the shooting spread quickly, sparking outrage among Marcus's colleagues at the FBI. When word reached his supervisor, Special Agent Laura Bennett, she immediately launched an internal investigation. Laura had always admired Marcus for his integrity and dedication, and hearing about the attack left her furious. She vowed to uncover the truth, no matter how high the stakes or how powerful the people involved might be. Laura assembled a team to review all available evidence, including surveillance footage, witness statements, and forensic reports. What they uncovered painted a damning picture of Lawson and Hicks's actions. The officers' attempts to frame Marcus fell apart under scrutiny, as inconsistencies in their stories became glaringly obvious. Moreover, records revealed troubling patterns of misconduct in their past cases, suggesting a history of abuse and corruption. As the investigation gained momentum, public attention turned to the broader issue of systemic racism within law enforcement. Civil rights organizations held press conferences demanding accountability and reform. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus Hale" and "No more cover-ups." Social media buzzed with hashtags calling for transparency and change. For many, Marcus's ordeal was more than just an isolated incident. It was emblematic of deeper problems that needed addressing. Back at the hospital, Marcus slowly regained his strength. Visitors streamed in daily, offering support and encouragement. Among them was Laura, who updated him on the progress of the investigation. "We're going to make sure they pay for what they did," she promised, her voice firm with conviction. "This isn't just about you. It's about everyone who deserves better from the system." Though grateful for the outpouring of solidarity, Marcus couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. He had always believed in the power of justice, but facing betrayal from within the very institution meant to uphold it shook him to his core. Still, he resolved to channel his pain into purpose. If sharing his story could inspire change, then he owed it to himself and to countless others to speak up. By the time Marcus was discharged from the hospital, the case against Lawson and Hicks had grown stronger than ever. Evidence mounted, witnesses testified, and public pressure intensified. The stage was set for a trial that would not only determine the fate of two rogue officers, but also shine a light on the flaws plaguing the justice system. For Marcus, the road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let fear or hatred silence him. His fight was far from over, and he intended to see it through until the bitter end. The weeks following Marcus's hospitalization were a whirlwind of activity. As his body healed from the gunshot wound, his mind remained focused on one goal: ensuring that justice was served. The public outcry over his case had reached fever pitch, with news outlets covering every development and social media platforms ablaze with discussions about police accountability. For Marcus, this wasn't just about revenge or retribution. It was about exposing the truth and holding people accountable for their actions. But more than that, it was about creating lasting change in a system riddled with flaws. Special Agent Laura Bennett became Marcus's closest ally during this time. She visited him regularly, bringing updates on the investigation and offering words of encouragement. Her determination mirrored his own, and together, they formed a formidable partnership. Laura had spent years working alongside Marcus, and she knew how much he valued fairness and integrity. Seeing him targeted not because of his actions but because of who he was, a black man, ignited a fire within her. "This isn't just your fight anymore," she told him firmly one afternoon. "It's ours." With Laura leading the charge, the FBI launched a comprehensive probe into Lawson and Hicks's conduct. They reviewed hours of surveillance footage, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed forensic evidence. What emerged was a disturbing pattern of behavior. Lawson and Hicks weren't isolated bad apples. They were part of a culture of impunity that allowed racism and corruption to fester unchecked. Records showed multiple complaints filed against them over the years, ranging from excessive force to racial profiling. Yet none of these allegations had ever been properly investigated, let alone punished. It was clear that the system had failed, not only Marcus but countless others who had fallen victim to similar abuses. As the evidence mounted, so did public pressure. Civil rights organizations rallied behind Marcus, organizing marches and vigils to demand accountability. Protesters carried signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Marcus Hale" and "Enough is enough." Local leaders joined the chorus, calling for reforms to address systemic issues within law enforcement. Even national Figures weighed in, using Marcus's story as a rallying cry for broader change. The message was simple yet powerful. No one should have to endure what Marcus went through, especially those tasked with protecting society. Despite the overwhelming support, Marcus couldn't shake the emotional toll of the ordeal. Nights were the hardest. He often lay awake, replaying the events of that fateful night in his mind. The sound of gunfire echoed in his ears, and the faces of Lawson and Hicks haunted his dreams. During the day, he tried to stay busy, attending physical therapy sessions and preparing for the upcoming trial. But the weight of it all pressed down on him, making it hard to focus. Friends and family urged him to seek counseling, reminding him that healing wasn't just physical, it was mental and emotional too. Reluctantly, Marcus agreed, knowing they were right. The trial itself became a spectacle, drawing attention from across the country. Courtrooms were packed with reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens eager to witness history unfold. Lawyers for both sides presented their cases passionately, each argument carrying immense weight. Prosecutors highlighted the damning evidence against Lawson and Hicks, including surveillance footage showing them threatening and shooting Marcus without provocation. They also emphasized the officers' attempts to frame him by planting false evidence, painting a picture of calculated malice. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, tried to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. They argued that Lawson and Hicks had acted in self-defense, claiming that Marcus had posed a credible threat. They questioned the credibility of witnesses and attempted to discredit the surveillance footage, alleging it had been tampered with. At times, their tactics bordered on desperate, but the jury remained attentive, weighing every piece of evidence carefully. Throughout the proceedings, Marcus sat stoically in the courtroom, his presence a quiet reminder of the human cost of injustice. Though testifying was difficult, he recounted the events of that night with clarity and composure. His testimony struck a chord with everyone present, vividly illustrating the fear and pain he had endured. When asked why he thought Lawson and Hicks had attacked him, Marcus paused for a moment before answering. "I believe it was because of the color of my skin," he said softly, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. "They didn't see me as a fellow officer or even as a person. To them, I was just someone they could intimidate and silence." His statement resonated deeply, not just with the jury but with the entire nation watching the trial unfold. It laid bare the ugly reality of racism and bias that still permeated institutions meant to protect and serve. Social media lit up with reactions, many praising Marcus's courage while others reflected on their own experiences with discrimination. Hashtags like #DangerStandWithMarcus trended worldwide, amplifying calls for reform. In addition to Marcus's testimony, other witnesses provided crucial insights. The young woman who had found him bleeding in the street described his fragile state and the urgency of the situation. Forensic experts confirmed that the planted evidence matched neither Marcus nor the scene, further dismantling the officer's claims. Even former colleagues of Lawson and Hicks came forward, sharing stories of their abusive behavior and toxic attitudes. Each account added another layer to the prosecution's case, leaving little room for reasonable doubt. As closing arguments approached, tension filled the air. Both sides delivered impassioned speeches, urging the jury to consider the broader implications of their verdict. The prosecution implored them to send a message that such actions would not be tolerated, while the defense pleaded for leniency, insisting their clients had simply made a mistake. After days of deliberation, the jury finally reached a decision. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps. Lawson and Hicks were found guilty on multiple charges, including attempted murder, aggravated assault, and obstruction of justice. The judge wasted no time in handing down sentences, 14 years in prison without parole for each officer. The ruling sent shockwaves through the community, signaling a rare but significant victory in the fight against police misconduct. For Marcus, the outcome brought a sense of closure, but not complete peace. While he was relieved that Lawson and Hicks would face consequences for their actions, he knew the battle wasn't over. True justice required more than punishing individuals. It demanded systemic change. With renewed purpose, Marcus vowed to dedicate himself to advocacy work, pushing for policies that promoted transparency, accountability, and equity within law enforcement. His journey had been long and painful, but it had also ignited a spark, belief that even in the face of darkness, light could prevail. The guilty verdict against officers Greg Lawson and Ryan Hicks marked a turning point, not just for Marcus Hale, but for the entire city. The courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers, tears, and sighs of relief as the judge's gavel came down with finality. For many, it was a moment of vindication, a rare instance where accountability had triumphed over corruption. But for Marcus, the victory felt bittersweet. Yes, justice had been served, at least in part. Yet the scars of that night, both physical and emotional, remained, a constant reminder of the cost of standing up to injustice. In the days following the trial, Marcus found himself thrust into the national spotlight. News outlets clamored for interviews, activists sought his endorsement, and ordinary citizens reached out to express their gratitude. While Marcus appreciated the support, he also felt overwhelmed. He had never sought fame or recognition. All he had ever wanted was to do his job and make a difference. Now his life had become a symbol of something much larger, a rallying cry for reform in a system long plagued by inequality and abuse. Despite the whirlwind around him, Marcus remained grounded. He leaned heavily on his family, friends, and colleagues for strength, drawing comfort from their unwavering belief in him. Special Agent Laura Bennett, who had stood by his side throughout the ordeal, continued to be a source of encouragement. "You've already done so much," she told him one evening over coffee. "But if you're ready, your voice can inspire real change." Inspired by her words, Marcus began to consider how he could use his experience to drive meaningful progress. He knew firsthand the devastating impact of systemic racism and unchecked power. If sharing his story could prevent others from enduring similar suffering, then it was a responsibility he couldn't ignore. Slowly but surely, he embraced his new role as an advocate, speaking out about the need for transparency, accountability, and equity within law enforcement. His first major platform came when a prominent civil rights organization invited him to address a large rally. Standing before thousands of people gathered in the heart of the city, Marcus took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. "I didn't ask for this fight," he began, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "But here I am, and I won't back down. What happened to me wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, a problem we can no longer afford to ignore." He went on to recount the events of that fateful night, describing the fear, pain, and anger he had felt as Lawson and Hicks turned their weapons on him. His words painted a vivid picture, forcing listeners to confront the harsh realities faced by marginalized communities. "When those officers looked at me, they didn't see a human being," he said, pausing to let the gravity of his statement sink in. "They saw someone they thought they could intimidate, silence, and destroy. And they weren't wrong to think that way, not because I'm weak, but because the system has taught them they can act with impunity." The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus wasn't finished. He shifted gears, focusing on solutions rather than grievances. "We need policies that hold everyone accountable, no exceptions," he declared. "Body cameras, independent oversight boards, stricter penalties for misconduct. These aren't radical ideas. They're common sense measures that protect both officers and the communities they serve. But more importantly, we need to address the root causes of bias and prejudice. That starts with education, empathy, and a commitment to treating every person with dignity and respect." His speech resonated deeply, earning widespread praise and sparking renewed calls for reform. Lawmakers took notice, introducing legislation aimed at increasing police accountability and promoting diversity within departments. Community leaders organized workshops and dialogues to foster understanding between law enforcement and the public. Even some police chiefs expressed willingness to implement changes, acknowledging that rebuilding trust required action, not just words. As momentum grew, Marcus became a fixture at conferences, panel discussions, and town halls across the country. His calm demeanor, sharp insights, and personal experiences made him a powerful voice in the movement for justice. He spoke not just as a victim, but as a survivor, someone who refused to let hatred define him. Along the way, he connected with others who had faced similar struggles, forming bonds that strengthened his resolve. One particularly moving encounter occurred during a visit to a youth center in a low-income neighborhood. As Marcus shared his story with a group of teenagers, one young man raised his hand hesitantly. "Do you ever feel scared?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, meeting the boy's gaze with sincerity. "Every day," he admitted. "But courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you are." The room fell silent, the weight of his response sinking in. Later, several teens approached Marcus to thank him, their eyes shining with admiration. For them, he represented hope, a living example that resilience could overcome adversity. These moments reminded Marcus why he had chosen this path, fueling his determination to keep pushing forward. Behind the scenes, however, the journey wasn't easy. Advocacy work demanded time, energy, and emotional labor, often leaving Marcus drained. There were days when doubt crept in, whispering that his efforts might not make a difference. On those occasions, he leaned on his support network, reminding himself of the bigger picture. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Laura reminded him during one particularly tough week. "But every step you take brings us closer to a better future." Marcus also found solace in small victories. When a local department adopted mandatory de-escalation training after hearing his testimony, he celebrated quietly, knowing lives would be saved as a result. When a high school student wrote to tell him his story had inspired her to pursue a career in law enforcement, he felt a surge of pride. These moments, though seemingly minor, reinforced his belief that progress was possible, even if it came slowly. As months turned into years, Marcus's advocacy evolved beyond speeches and rallies. He collaborated with lawmakers to draft legislation, consulted with police departments on implementing reforms, and mentored young people interested in careers in law enforcement. His ultimate goal was simple yet ambitious: to create a world where no one had to endure what he had gone through. It was a lofty ideal, but Marcus believed it was worth striving for. Looking back on his journey, Marcus realized how far he had come since that dark night in the alley. The road ahead was still long, fraught with challenges and setbacks, but he faced it with a sense of purpose, knowing that every effort brought society one step closer to true justice. His scars, visible and invisible, were reminders of the battles he had fought and the ones yet to come. And while the fight was far from over, Marcus stood tall, ready to continue leading the charge toward a brighter, fairer future. As the years passed, Marcus Hale's life transformed in ways he could never have imagined. What had begun as a harrowing ordeal became a catalyst for profound change, not just in his own journey, but in the lives of countless others. Though the physical wounds from that fateful night eventually healed, the emotional scars remained, serving as a reminder of both the pain he had endured and the resilience he had discovered within himself. But rather than letting bitterness consume him, Marcus chose to channel his experiences into something meaningful, a legacy of hope, courage, and progress. One of the most significant changes in Marcus's life was the shift in his career. While he still worked with the FBI, his role evolved beyond traditional investigative duties. He became a senior advisor on community relations and reform initiatives, using his expertise to bridge gaps between law enforcement agencies and the communities they served. His unique perspective, as someone who had been both an officer and a victim of police misconduct, made him invaluable in these efforts. Colleagues often remarked on his ability to listen deeply, speak authentically, and find common ground even in the most contentious situations. Marcus also took on a mentorship role, guiding young agents who looked up to him as a role model. Many of them were minorities or women entering fields where they might face bias or discrimination. Marcus understood their struggles intimately, and he made it his mission to ensure they felt supported and empowered. "You belong here," he would tell them during training sessions. "Don't let anyone make you question your worth." His words carried weight because they came not just from theory, but from lived experience. Outside of work, Marcus continued to advocate for systemic reform. He traveled extensively, speaking at conferences, universities, and community events about the importance of accountability, transparency, and empathy in policing. His speeches weren't just lectures, they were heartfelt conversations designed to inspire action. He shared stories of people whose lives had been shattered by injustice, highlighting the urgent need for change. At the same time, he acknowledged the good officers doing difficult jobs under challenging circumstances, emphasizing that reform wasn't about vilifying all police, but about rooting out corruption and fostering trust. One of Marcus's proudest achievements was co-founding an organization dedicated to supporting victims of police misconduct. The nonprofit provided legal assistance, counseling, and advocacy resources to individuals and families affected by abuse of power. It also worked to amplify marginalized voices, ensuring that those often ignored by mainstream narratives had a platform to share their truths. Through this initiative, Marcus connected with survivors from across the country, forming bonds that reminded him he wasn't alone in his fight. Their courage fueled his determination to keep pushing forward. While Marcus's public advocacy garnered widespread acclaim, his personal healing journey was equally important. Therapy played a crucial role in helping him process the trauma of being attacked by fellow officers. In sessions, he confronted lingering fears, anger, and grief, learning healthy ways to cope with the emotions that sometimes threatened to overwhelm him. Friends and family noticed a shift in his demeanor over time. He seemed lighter, more at peace. Though the memories of that night would always be with him, they no longer controlled him. Art became another outlet for Marcus's healing. Inspired by a friend, he began painting as a way to express feelings that words couldn't capture. His artwork depicted themes of struggle, resilience, and redemption, resonating deeply with viewers. One piece, titled "Shadows and Light," showed a figure emerging from darkness into sunlight, symbolizing Marcus's own journey toward recovery. The painting went viral online, further cementing his status as a beacon of hope for many. On a broader scale, Marcus's advocacy contributed to tangible policy changes. Several states adopted laws mandating body cameras for all officers, establishing independent oversight boards, and requiring bias training for recruits. Police departments implemented new protocols aimed at reducing incidents of excessive force and improving interactions with minority communities. While not every proposed reform succeeded, each victory reinforced Marcus's belief that persistence mattered. "Change is slow," he often said, "but every step forward counts." Perhaps the most rewarding aspect of Marcus's work was seeing its impact on younger generations. Schools invited him to speak to students about leadership, perseverance, and standing up for what's right. Teenagers wrote letters thanking him for inspiring them to pursue careers in law enforcement, social justice, or public service. One young woman named Maya told him she wanted to become a lawyer after hearing his story. "If you can survive what happened to you and still believe in making things better," she wrote, "then I know I can too." Marcus's influence extended beyond individual lives to entire communities. Neighborhoods once divided by mistrust began to heal as residents and officers worked together on projects like cleanup drives, youth mentorship programs, and safety workshops. These collaborations fostered mutual understanding, breaking down barriers that had long seemed insurmountable. Marcus frequently attended such events, lending his presence and encouragement. Watching relationships transform before his eyes filled him with a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. Of course, challenges remained. Not everyone welcomed Marcus's message, and he occasionally faced backlash from critics who accused him of undermining law enforcement. Some argued that focusing on bad apples gave the profession a bad name, while others dismissed calls for reform as unnecessary or extreme. But Marcus refused to engage in arguments that detracted from his mission. Instead, he focused on building bridges, inviting skeptics to join him in finding solutions rather than dwelling on disagreements. By the 10th anniversary of the trial, Marcus stood atop a stage addressing a massive crowd gathered for a rally, celebrating progress in police reform. Looking out at the sea of faces, young and old, diverse yet united, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. 10 years ago, he began. I thought my story ended in that alley, but today I see how it was only the beginning. Together, we've shown that justice isn't just a dream. It's something we can build, brick by brick. The audience erupted in applause, cheering not just for Marcus but for the movement he represented. As confetti rained down and music played, Marcus stepped off the stage, embracing friends, colleagues, and strangers alike. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel truly proud, not just of what he had accomplished, but of the collective effort that had brought them this far. Looking ahead, Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. There were still battles to wage, injustices to confront, and hearts to change. But he also knew that the seeds of transformation had been planted. With each person inspired to take action, the roots grew stronger, reaching deeper into the soil of society. And as long as there were people willing to stand up, speak out, and work together, the future held promise. For Marcus Hale, the road had been long and fraught with obstacles. Yet through it all, he had remained steadfast, driven by a vision of a world where no one had to endure what he had gone through. His scars were a testament to his strength, his story a beacon of hope. And as he walked away from the rally, surrounded by loved ones and supporters, he smiled, not because the journey was complete, but because he knew the best was yet to come.